Welcome to The Rest is Giant Robots, a conversation through the careers of writer Simon Furman and artist Andrew Wildman. Recollections and revelations about the highs and the lows as creatives in comics, books, games, film and TV.
Hi there, welcome to The Rest is Giant Robots. I'm Simon Furman, writer on Transformers and many other comics and TV animation series.
And hi, I'm Andrew Wildman, artist on comics, Transformers, Venom, Spider-Man, all that stuff, and storyboard artist for TV and film. Yeah.
Great. So I thought this time we get back on track a bit because we tend to wander off on our own little digressions and talk about what I think we touched on a little bit of last time, which was Transformers we are both working on by this point in sort of 89 to 90. And, but both of us, I think, were kind of really keen to move on to what I'll call mainstream Marvel books, not non-licensed things, the things we'd grown up reading. So I kind of wondered, let's start off with you. What was your first bit of non-Transformers Marvel work?
First bit of non-Transformers Marvel work, if I remember rightly, was G.I. Joe. So when we found out that Transformers was going to be cancelled, which was an absolute bloody bombshell, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Obviously I started putting the word out. I mean, I didn't know that many people at Marvel US, unlike, I mean, you'd met lots of them before. I didn't know many. So obviously I knew Rob Tokar, who was the editor on Transformers. But having been over there to see Rob when I was first started doing the book, I met Chris Cooper as well. So then Chris Cooper was Rob's assistant editor. And luckily for me, Chris Cooper went to become Bobby Chase's assistant editor. Bobby Chase was the editor on Hulk, amongst other things. And so I don't know how much of a gap I had, or whether there was any gap. I mean, we knew that Transformers was being cancelled, and we probably had like a couple of issues to do. So that gave me like a couple of months, I guess. I was doing bits and pieces outside of Marvel. I was doing a comic strip for the RSPB, so the Royal Society of Protection of Birds in the UK had a young kind of children's side to it. So it was the Young Ornithologist Club, and I used to do a comic strip in their magazine. So I had other bits and pieces going on. Anyway, I was contacted by Chris asking me if I wanted to try out to do G.I. Joe, which was like an easy jump. It was another Hasbro book, although it was supposedly real people. It was human people. So,
Yep.
So I think, as far as I remember, that was the first thing that came on board.
Cool. And for me, it was a kind of slow evolution towards, I guess, more mainstream Marvel, because while I was still writing Transformers, I did Brute Force, which I think we mentioned last time, which was this 4-issue series that a guy had, the kind of creator of Brute Force, had bought to Marvel, and Marvel thought this would be a cool way to do the reverse Transformers thing, and they would create a comic designed to be licensed by a toy company and turned into action figures. So that was the rationale behind Brute Force. And Bob Budiansky was the special projects editor, so he was in charge. He couldn't write it directly, as Marvel had that policy about editors writing for their own or editing their own stuff. A lot of Marvel editors wrote and edited, but the twain never was allowed to meet. So Bob basically, looked around, and I was the most obvious choice, I guess, or the nearest person in and around the office at that time. And and I got given brute force to do. And it was a strange one, brute force. It still looks a little bonkers when you look at it now. Animals animals being experimented on, not a good thing, really.
You still
And
wouldn't get away with that now, would you?
no, probably not. And kind of clad in exosuit armor and
Yeah.
given Uzis and other, you know, heavy duty weaponry. It
It's
was a
like a
strange
box.
one.
It's like a box ticking exercise, isn't it? Somebody's good idea was right. If I can, I'm gonna have got this list of boxes now. I've made them all up out of what I think is popular and all the fans would like, and I've desperately got to tick them all.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was the 90s, so I guess, giving an Uzi to a dolphin in an exosuit didn't seem extreme for that kind of time, especially in comics.
Yeah.
But yeah, very weird. And Brute Force felt like, even though it was the other way round, it still felt like I was in the licensed comics arena I'd been inhabiting for quite a while.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't really until, funnily enough, good old Bobby Chase
Ah,
turned
there we go.
turned around and offered me RoboCop,
Oh yeah.
which felt like one step closer, sort of to a Marvel comic. As
Hmm.
you say, it wasn't really robots. It was more a guy in armor, and I love the movies.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I got Alan Grant had left the comic, and I was drafted in. And what I hadn't realized about RoboCop until recently, I was reading a blog post or Facebook post from Greg Wright, who was the colorist on the series. He was saying that Orion, the film company, had been very sort of hands-on in an obstructive way with RoboCop the comic.
Hmm.
Instead of just doing the movie, which was very violent, very visceral, they wanted a sort of watered down RoboCop, which just didn't really sit well with. I don't think it sat well with Alan Grant, or I think Lee was just enjoying drawing it, but um, there were a lot of wrangles, I think, over the direction. But luckily, by the time I came on board with issue 12, that had all passed. Orion, I guess, had stopped, sort of going through every script with a fine tooth comb.
Hmm.
And luckily by then I was able to do more movie RoboCop stories. So
Yeah.
that was great. And it meant I was working with Lee Sullivan again, which was a joy.
Hmm.
And yeah, that was my first chunk, really, because I think I did about 11 or 12 issues of RoboCop till that was cancelled. And yeah, that was great. It felt like, oh, I'm writing an ongoing now, not just a licensed mini series.
Hmm.
And also through Bobby, I got given a shot at She-Hulk, which
Okay.
she also edited. So I, was given a kind of, with a slight proviso that John Byrne was making noises about wanting to come back to the book after, a while off. But I thought, great, this really is mainstream Marvel Universe stuff.
Hmm.
And so my first issue, She-Hulk 24, the first thing I did was put Death's Head in there.
Of course you did.
That was my very first Marvel mainstream job. And I thought, got to get Death's Head in there as soon as possible. And Brian Hitch was drawing the series.
Oh
So it
yes. Yeah.
so it kind of made sense. But it was just like any excuse to get Death's Head into the mainstream Marvel universe. I grabbed it with both hands. And so that was my sort of little path to something more mainstream. And so where did you go from GI Joe?
Um. So GI Joe. I was on that for quite a while. I think I was on that for about 18 months in total. So it was a good run, a longer run than than I was on Transformers. GI Joe was an interesting experience. I mean, working with Larry Hama was amazing in so many great and strange ways. But
Yeah.
you know, I'll talk about that another time maybe. But he was good. I was a fantastic writer. So I was on that for about 18 months, but I did want to get off of it because, yeah, like you, I wanted to get on something which was a proper Marvel book. And I went, I can't remember how it came about, but I think somebody who was part of the editorial team, no, I think it was Chris Cooper, who was the assistant editor on it. Um, one of his somebody he knew really, really well in the Marvel offices was a guy who was going to be taking over Quasar. I think it was Quasar.
Mhm.
And I had an opportunity, and my name kind of was mentioned to do that. So I had an opportunity to pick up that book, which Greg Capullo was doing the artwork for at that time. So I was going to be replacing Greg, and I loved his work on Quasar. I thought it was amazing. So I was really happy to be considered for that. So Kelly Corvese, I think his name was, who was the editor on it. Um, he asked me to try out. So he said, just do like a splash page with a load of characters on it, you know, but as long as Quasar is a central character, you know, and he mentioned some of the characters he wanted, and I did it. And I mean, I thought I did a really good job on it, but it got put to, you know, put upstairs to for a judgment to be made, and apparently not. It was like Transformers
Mm.
all over again. So they said no, they didn't want, and I don't know who they eventually got to do the book. Maybe somebody became available who was, you know, far more caliber and a more of a known name than I was. So, um, but then they said, well, we have got another project that we'd be interested in you having a look at, and that was X-Men Adventures. So it was the X-Men book, but kind of not proper X-Men book. I mean, it had all the proper characters in it, but it was an adaptation of the animated TV series. And so I decided that I would do that, but they didn't really want me to not do G.I. Joe. So I think for about 6 issues, I was doing both. I was overlapping and doing two books.
Mm.
So that was a really heavy workload, but obviously I desperately wanted, because, you know, it's extra money. That was good. And God bless him, Stephen Baskerville was was inking some very, very light pencils on G.I. Joe, which got lighter and lighter and lighter. And he was more than happy to pick up and sort of finish them off. So I was effectively doing layouts and he was doing finishes.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, X-Men Adventures after
Yep.
G.I. Joe.
Yeah. And getting back to my side of it, She-Hulk didn't last very long. Sure enough, John Byrne came back after I'd done 4 issues. So,
Right.
but I still felt I'd got my mainstream Marvel universe start, and hoped that wasn't it. But about the same time, I got a chance, and I'm not sure who was editing the book, but Marvel Comics Presents was this little anthology title they did, little 8-page stories. The Wolverine Weapon X story was running in it at
Mm.
the time, and I got the chance to pitch for a Death's Head story, and I'd have to check back on who edited it at the time, but they just came to me and said, "Would you like to do a Death's Head story?" And I was like, "Absolutely." And so, I managed to sort of sneak a Death's Head story into that obviously quite popular run of Marvel Comics Presents that had the Barry Windsor Smith Weapon
Mm.
X in it. And again, we got Brian to draw it, so it looked very much, a good British product again. And so, that was really nice, but I still kind of was lacking, I think, that big Marvel book that I wanted. I'd love to have done any of the Spider-Man titles, or it's funny enough, I was less keen on doing X-Men because it was
Okay.
so sort of crossovery, and of course, as Spider-Man became very soon afterwards. But it always felt like with X-Men you would end up doing always part of a big crossover storyline,
Mm.
which is never that great in terms of, I just like to be able to tell my own little chunk of story. And so even when, basically the book I did get was Alpha Flight,
Mm.
which, Rob had taken over as editor. And I think a few writers were, interested in taking on the book. But whatever my pitch was, it sort of grabbed Rob's attention the most of the ones. And so I was given Alpha Flight, and that really, really felt like, oh, good, I've got a ongoing comic, that was still selling, I guess, reasonably well, because this was the era of royalties when you would actually
Mm.
get a royalty check from Marvel, which was just stunning. You know, I used to sort of say it's kind of money for old rope, because you get paid your fee for the issue, and then however many months later you might be lucky enough to get a nice decently fat royalty check.
Yeah, yeah. It was a kind of didn't happen too many times for me, but it definitely did. My first royalty check was on G.I. Joe because G.I. Joe was quite a good, a
Mm,
well-selling book. And I wish I'd kept the check actually, the wonderful check with Spider-Man on it and all that kind of thing,
yeah.
because the check was for a wonderful 99 cents. So it
Excellent.
cost them more to generate it and post it to me than than it was worth. But at least I thought, oh wow, I've kind of
Mm.
moved into that league now.
but but X-Men Adventures must have been a royalty threshold book, mustn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. I mean, issue one, purely because it got X-Men on the cover and because it got issue one on the cover. And because, collectors were just, going crazy, weren't they? Buying stuff that they thought had some kind of value. So on X-Men, the royalty check, I think, was $11,000,
Mm.
which was just like, what the hell? When it turned up, I couldn't believe it. I was like, I didn't get paid anywhere near that much to draw the whole thing, but then
Yes.
so that bought a conservatory. And then there were a few royalty checks after that, but they did decline quite
Yeah.
rapidly. Issue number
Yeah.
6 went up. The figures spiked a little bit, but it was still just, nice to have, but it wasn't going to change the world.
No. Same with here with Alpha Flight. The first chunk of issues were still obviously selling decently well, but then it petered off to the point where I'm not sure I was getting royalties at all on some of the
Mm,
later issues.
no, same here.
But yeah,
Mm,
that was definitely good. I mean, Alpha Flight for me felt like I say, proper mainstream Marvel. I could use guest stars, I could use super villains. It felt like it was immersed. And but one of the storylines we did, I mean, we introduced a few new characters. I kind of bumped up Wild Child, who was this sort of proto Wolverine character,
mm.
into more of a main character and gave him a new name. And we introduced a funnily enough, I did a podcast quite recently, uh, where they devoted a large section of it to this really obscure character called Wire, with a Y, so it was WYRE.
Of course, yeah.
And and he was exactly what the 90s were about. Big, chunky, weaponized, somewhat, connected to the Weapon X program. It was one of those things where it was like I was doing my own little box ticking then of what I thought a popular character should have.
Yeah.
So that was nice. And then, soon after that, we did a little storyline called The Clampdown, which was about superheroes in Canada, because of course they're the Canadian super team,
Mm.
having to register, and all the sort of fallout from this act coming into force. And funnily enough, this was almost the precursor to Marvel's Civil War, which was the Superhero Registration Act in the US. And so, it's funny, not that, I claim any responsibility for Civil War, but it was funny that we sort of did it in Alpha Flight before the US did their version of it, which I always was pleased with. And we guest starred Spider-Man in an issue, which meant I got to write Spider-Man finally. And
Hey.
yeah, lifelong ambition box ticked, definitely. And yeah, and then rest of it was slightly odds and sods. I worked on What If. I did a Ms. Marvel story that rounded off the original Claremont stories. And then I did odd things like Captain Planet and Toxic Crusaders. But, I never quite got that long run on, one of the core Marvel titles. That somehow just sort of eluded me.
Yeah, I mean, so what sort of dates are we talking? Yeah, I guess like me, we were talking about that sort of not 90 and then through like two, three, four, that kind of
Yeah,
early half of the
definitely.
90s. Yeah.
I mean, 94 was definitely when it all started to fall away. So, very quickly. And I think Rob, who was editing a lot of those titles, even kind of started to put in the corner box Apocalypse 94 or something, because so many books he was editing were cancelled. And
Mm,
that's no reflection on Rob. I think it was that era where the bubble had burst somewhat, and anything on the periphery of the cutoff threshold was just being axed left, right, and center.
mm,
So yeah, lots of things started folding up, and eventually Alpha Flight as well, one of the last ones to go. But even that, I think, finished in '94, and then maybe I did the North Star Limited series
mm,
after that.
mm,
But very much by the end of '94, that was me done with Marvel for my first period. But
mm,
again, what about you? And you definitely moved. I remember you doing an issue of the Hulk,
mm,
and of course you did lots of Spider-Man stuff and Venom.
mm. Yeah, I mean, when I think back to those kind of post Transformers, so 90, I was off of Transformers, and then for like th 2 or 3 years, when I think back to it, it's surprising how much stuff I did, some of which because it was only in, 4 issues or whatever, but yeah, there was a lot of stuff I worked on. So after I finished G.I. Joe, then carried on with X-Men Adventures, and then straight off the back of X-Men Adventures, I was asked to do. I think the first thing that I did after that was the um, four issue series of Black Cat, Felicia Hardy,
Mm.
um, and that was just like wow, because yeah, I mean Spider-Man was in it. That was the first thing.
Mm.
Opening splash page had got Spider-Man, although it was the back of him, but then yeah, he did feature in it quite a lot. So that was the first book that I did that was in the proper Marvel continuity, proper Marvel universe. Um, so it was a 4 issue book, always slated to be a 4 issue book. And I mean, it's still people still refer to it, these days. It's still one of those Black Cat books that is referred back to as, one that people fondly remember, which is always really nice to kind of have that. But obviously, four issues doesn't give you a like a solid footing on something. I think like you want to have a long run on a proper book.
Yeah.
So you can turn up to conventions and people say, "What do you do?" And you say, "Oh, I draw Captain America," and it's just like, "Yes, thank you very much." Mic drop. That just wasn't happening for us, was it? But and then after that, I was asked to do another Spider-Man book, which was a 6 issue limited series called Spider-Man: The Arachnist Project. And both of those, Black Cat and the Arachnist Project, we got Stephen Baskerville on board as Inca. And I think we were both trying so hard because we desperately wanted to get a foothold in the proper books that I think we were both doing really the best work we'd ever done. I mean, I was really pushing myself. Um, and then after the Arachnist Project, um, I can't remember which came next. Probably Venom. Oh, I did, and the issue of Hulk. I did 2 issues of Robocop with you, didn't I?
You did, yes. Was it two or one? I can always remember the cover is the sort of grave and the hand coming out of the grave
Yeah,
of Murphy, which was a very great cover. But it might well have been two. Yes.
yeah. Because
Yeah.
that
Yeah. We.
on that cover, I don't know whether you wrote it or whether I made it up. I'd be surprised if I made it up, but on the grave on the gravestone it says, "Here lies Sam R. Faulkner's cut down in his prime."
Yeah.
Which, which
Yes.
Sam R. Faulkner's was an anagram of Optimus Prime. Um, I, th
Yeah.
I got a feeling I take the credit for that one.
I think it's highly likely. I doubt I'd have put that detail, even if I did the cover description.
Yeah, because I
Yeah.
think Transformers was still kind of on our mind, and because you were writing it as well, I thought I need to make a little statement here.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there was that. Yeah, there was one issue of the Hulk because Bobby was editor on that, and wow, what the hell was the name of the guy that used to draw Hulk at the time, doing incredible work on it, and
Dale Keown.
Dale Keown, yeah, fantastic work on that. So when they asked me to do a fill-in issue, I was like, wow, why have they asked me? Um, but yeah, great that they did. So that was kind of fun. Yeah, so then Venom, four-issue Venom series, written by Larry Hama. So it was really nice to work with Larry again.
Mm.
And obviously an incredible character to draw. One of the things I found on the Spider-Man books, I found fairly early on when I was doing Black Cat, the few times that he appeared in it, was that like you, I grew up reading Spider-Man comics, and that was the one character emotionally that I wanted to have a chance at drawing, but actually drawing that character is just horrible because because he doesn't have a face. So I mean, even with Transformers, I gave them expressions because I always liked giving expressions to characters. And then suddenly Spider-Man, it's like, damn, he hasn't got a face. Well, how am I going to get this expression in this? And this was pre the kind of, you know, too much expression with the eyes. I mean, they go crazy with it now in real like
Mm.
Deadpool fashion, don't they? But
Yeah.
but there wasn't even that then. So it was just eyebrows. You could get a bit of kind of a bit of movement, a movement on the top of the eye shape, on the eyebrows to get some sort of expression. Um, and occasionally I used to try and get a dip where the mouth was, so you could see if the mouth was open, because it harked back to the old, for me, harked back to the old version when we were kids, or not kids, but young, of Captain Britain, not the Alan Davis one, but the was a Herb Trimp, wasn't it?
Yeah.
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 Um, and where he had like a full face, a kind of a full face mask, but you could see, I was just fascinated by the way you could see when his mouth was open, just by the way that Herb had drawn some lines to kind of express that. So
Mm.
I used to try and get a little bit of that in. But then Venom, yeah. So still in the Spider-Man universe, um, that Venom book was something that I really enjoyed doing. Really enjoyed the fact that, I've got some momentum here. I'm moving up. It's going to keep going. But I mean, the Venom one was amazing all these years later, where it's been reprinted so many times, and the cover of Venom, I think it was part two, has been homaged so many times as well.
Mm.
And Andy Serkis and the creative team on the second Venom movie used Carnage Unleashed, that four-issue series that I did,
Mm.
as a huge amount of visual influence. He's told me that personally because he was in
Mm.
Luther that I worked on. So I met him and he was like, "Oh
Yeah.
my God," he said, "we used to reference that so much."
Uh,
So it's not until
Great.
like all these years later that some of these things kind of follow you around. At the time, it was, it's like, yeah, great to draw it, but it was short-lived. But then I went on
Yeah.
to Spider-Man 2099.
Mm.
Um, Again, I don't really know what the contact with that was there. Joey Cavalieri was the editor, but I hadn't met him before. I don't know whether I don't know within the office who hung out with who and how he'd seen my work, but anyway. So I did about 18 months on that as well, which is great. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Great character. Um, but then, yeah, like you say, it all started to go a bit wrong in the mid 90s.
Mm.
Um, I hung on and hung on. I think off Spider-Man 2099 was going to be cancelled. Joey Cavalieri wanted to give the last few issues to Ron Lim, who was an artist that he'd worked with before, and wanted him to see the book out, which is fine. I was kind of desperate then, didn't have it, didn't know what else was going to come up because so many books were getting cancelled. Nel Yomtov, the amazing colorist on the Transformers book that we worked in, who colored every single issue of Transformers for Marvel. He was an editor there. Coloring was just his side hustle. Um, but he was editing Iron Man, and also a book called Force Works, which was essentially the extension of West Coast Avengers. Um, and I went in to see him in his office, and he said, um, "I said, have you got any work? Because they're cancelling Spider-Man 2099 on me." Um, and he said, "No." He said, "I've got Force Works. The artist on it wants to move on." He said, "You can finish off the penultimate issue, and then you can do the whole of the last issue." So I took him up on that. And I think my work in comics, certainly for Marvel, that last issue of Force Works is the best work I ever did.
Mm.
I just, yeah, I mean, I've still got a lot of the original pages, and I look at it and think, did I do that? I don't even think I could do that now.
Yeah.
But there we go. And then that was cancelled, and there was nothing left to have. I mean, I think I mentioned that early on in my career, I picked up a lot of work from finishing off stuff that other people didn't have time to complete or whatever, being a fill-in artist. But there wasn't any of that going on because, the great and the good amongst the art team were clamoring to get, what books there were left, get onto that Spider-Man or X-Men life raft kind of thing,
Yeah.
because everything else was was going to the dogs.
Yeah, it was a bad time. I mean, for a bit of context here, the early 90s there was this kind of speculators boom, wasn't there?
Mm,
And it was fueled somewhat, not just by the Image Comics thing, which was producing sort of mega sales. Originally the image creators for Marvel had just seemed to push the bar up in terms of sales figures,
mm,
and then the Image Comics thing itself. But there was also the Marvel marketing kind of department was pushing a lot of what I'd call slightly gimmicky things onto the comics, cover variants, which we still have today, but a lot of holographic covers
mm.
and um, glow in the dark covers
Yeah.
and
Oh, I did some of them.
holo
Yeah, Night Stalkers. I did that. Yeah.
hollow foil and everything. And it was sort of fueling this kind of speculator market where comics, any old comic almost, was selling gangbusters if it was a first issue, if it had a special cover. And it was almost like the investors were buying them in numbers to hold on to
Yeah.
for when they were worth more. And eventually this just wasn't sustainable, and this sort of bubble, the speculator bubble, burst. And everyone, all these people who'd been trying to invest in comics, moved elsewhere and realized it wasn't going anywhere, and sales just plummeted, I think, across
Mm,
not just Marvel, I'm sure DC and Dark Horse, where whoever else. But yeah, it just literally, the kind of bottom fell out of the market, really. And that's when loads of series that had just been, if you like, propped up or supported by the better selling series just started falling away in their droves.
Yeah, because they did have a real glut of books, didn't they, in that early 90s, because everything seemed to be selling. I can remember Joey, the editor on Spider-Man 2099, when it was all starting to go wrong, he said, I knew this was going to happen. And I was like, what, did you tell anyone? No, but he said everybody was under this illusion that comics sales had increased, and that more buyers had come into the market.
Mm,
And he said there was definitely some of that because of how, comics became popular again. A lot of that was to do with Watchmen, because comics got back into the, you know, the
yeah.
the kind of creative press. So that's when people who weren't fans decided that, oh, maybe there's something in this, and comic sales were seen to go up. So they then started speculating and collecting comics. Marvel then would, like you say, do double up on covers or whatever. I mean, the Jim Lee X-Men had 6 covers, and because
Yeah.
everybody had to buy everything, well, they didn't have to, but I mean, like, why wouldn't
Yeah.
you? Because they all went together to make one nice big kind of illustration. So they would buy all of those. So even with only 1 or 2 additional covers on a book, so there'd be the standard cover and then the foil printed cover and then maybe an
Mm,
alternate artist or whatever. Um, that's going to triple the sales figures on each book. And then certainly fans were double bagging them. So they'd buy one to read and one to keep. So that the
mm,
one they were keeping was in, pristine grade 1 condition. And then the other one, it didn't matter because, I mean, grade 1, you lose that even if you've just opened it, because you can see a little white line crack down the spine that shows that the cover's been opened.
yeah.
So, so it wasn't that suddenly all these new readers and speculators, some of the speculators that were there went away to invest their money in something else, wine probably, or I don't know. Um, but it wasn't that there were that many more readers. It's just that the same number of readers were just buying more comics. And obviously they wised up and realized that they were being slightly ripped off by being forced to buy so many variants of the same book.
Yeah.
And
And
so,
I mean, and like you say, Marvel were just producing so much stuff in that time. I remember, I'm sure you did as well. You used to get, FedExed boxes full of comics every month.
yeah,
I was on a contributor list, and that meant you got everything Marvel published every month sent to you. God, it was a big heavy box that came
yeah,
over. And and I mean this as no disrespect, but 80% of it you could more or less just push to one side. And
yeah,
it was just, it was the era of, almost anything got at least a go around in the marketplace. And some of it just wasn't very good. And I think that was also long-term damaging to, comics generally.
yeah. I think it was. Yeah, it just kind of diluted the market, really, didn't it? The,
Yeah.
and I mean that's why you had Wolverine guest starring in so many things, like he had done in the certainly in the UK books. That's what they were doing. X-Men was
Mm,
so popular. You stick Wolverine in as a guest star, and you're going
yeah.
to sell some copies. But whether they sustain after that is a whole different thing.
And that was pretty much the backbone of that second wave of Marvel UK that we talked about
Mm,
last time. That Paul Neary universe, if you like, that he came in as editor in chief and more or less revamped the Marvel line. And yeah, that really was the sort of one where every issue was a guest star from the X universe.
mm. I mean, I think the other thing, with X-Men, because X-Men was not a particularly big selling book until Jim Lee um, picked it up, and because his work was incredible. I mean, I always thought his early work on Uncanny X-Men was better than what he then did on X-Men, because it became more and more stylized. But
Mm.
just the figure work, the quality of the work on Uncanny X-Men he did was incredible. But nevertheless, so X-Men became a big seller, and so it wasn't just X-Men and then X-Men characters guest starring in books that would increase sales, but what it also did, I think it created a almost a genre of its own. So very kind of cyber tech, the whole big guns thing. I mean, there weren't just superheroes now. They'd be wearing like bomber jackets, and there was lots
Mm,
of, they were accessorized, the gun belts thing. That all seemed to come out of the sort of Jim Lee X-Men and the whole kind of image guys thing. And so any books
yeah.
that kind of looked like that, people they just loved it. They lapped it up. It was definitely a style that overtook comics in a big way.
And like I say, that character I mentioned, Wire in Alpha Flight, very much I was guilty of the same thing of going, that's the kind of character people want in comics at the moment. So we better have one.
Mm,
Alpha Flight didn't have that. It was a much more eclectic mix of characters for the better, I would say. But yeah, there was that sort of slight pressure to almost, hit that 90s note of big guns, bullet belts,
yeah,
some kind of techno organic gimmick, seemed very popular. So
yeah.
yeah, it was a weird time to be working. I mean, very enjoyable, but yeah, there were a lot of underlying influences that maybe weren't, as conducive to good storytelling, because
Mm,
there were these things you had to like hit that note, hit that note. It was very much the the era of the anti-hero. So, you had that kind of Cable, Weapon X-y sort of style of these were the popular characters. Punisher was very big at the time, I
yeah.
remember. And I think that was it. There was that vibe at the time was this is what sells, you know. So if I'm doing Alpha Flight, we need an element of that at least in the mix. So and we got saddled with, I say saddled, we we given that the sales on Alpha Flight weren't, stellar, we tagged on to, I think it was the Infinity War and Infinity Crusade crossovers, the big
Okay.
cosmic thing.
Mm.
And, quite recently, a Marvel omnibus came out of the Infinity Crusade. And it's the only bit of my Alpha Flight run, I think, that's been reprinted. So that was kind of nice in a way, but a shame it was part of that.
Yeah, which is why it got reprinted because it's an integral part of maybe the you know
Yeah.
the sweeping storyline across all of that. The whole gun big just get back to the big guns thing. I can remember two things that editors said to me. I can't remember which editor it was. He said, "Yeah, anything will sell as long as it's got a hot chick with a big gun." So it was
Yeah.
it was very much an almost comics fanboy soft porn kind of thing as well when you think
Yeah.
about it. Um,
Yeah.
and then and I think it was Larry Hama that used to refer to them as chicklet guns. He's because he would sometimes in the description you say, "I'll make sure they've got a chicklet gun." And I thought he was referring to the fact that, this kind of hot chicks with big guns thing. And I asked him, and he said, no, it's nothing to do with chicks in that sense. He said, I call them chicklet guns because they look like guns made out of chiclets. And I'm like, what's the chicklet? I don't even know what that is. But it's what
Yeah.
Americans call the little sort of pillow-shaped chewing gum things that we
Mm.
have. Um, and it's like, oh yeah, see, yeah, they kind of do, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, I maintain that you can pick up a 90s comic and pretty much know immediately it's a 90s comic. It's
Mm,
funny, the 80s kind of look like the 80s and the 70s look like the 70s, and the 90s very much have their look, and it is that, you know, big gunned, you know, women with very little on, powerful looking women with very little on kind of, style of comics that was just in at the time.
yeah. I mean, I can remember there was also the conversation about that it always used to be said that a female lead comic would never sell. like you. I mean, obviously Wonder Woman, I guess, over at DC was probably a little bit of an exception to that, but that's essentially what they always had at Marvel. But but I guess that changed because and there were those that said, "Oh, it's great because you've got female lead comics. It's great for females to, be able to be doing that." But it's like, yeah, but it's not necessarily about girl power, is it? It's because they are hot chicks with big guns. So it's very much, it was so misdirected. I mean, kind of good in one way, but that's not where it was coming from.
I guess there's just one more thing to mention from this period, for me anyway. It's my run on What If, the Marvel, what would have happened if this happened instead of this happened comic. And
Mm,
that was in some ways my most satisfying bit of my Marvel career at this point, because you could go anywhere and jump into any storyline and twist it and take those characters in a new direction. So I did about 8 issues, and every one of them was a joy because I could find characters and storylines that I loved from when I'd been reading comics, and just take them in a new direction. I think I did
yeah.
one riff on the X-Men Dark Phoenix story. I spun another one out of that wonderful Michael Golden Avengers annual that had them against the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. And just generally, I loved it. My first one was just called "What If the Punisher Had Become Captain America," and I know, and it spins out of the tiniest little bit of Captain America, which I happen to know that at one point he's literally taken out of action to the point where he, a bit like the later Batman thing, he may have broken his back or whatever,
Mm,
and he's out of commission. And I spun that into a little line of, well, what if they looked around for a substitute Captain America and found Vietnam vet Frank Castle,
mm,
and put him in the Stars and Stripes. And again, I just loved What If. It was a positive pleasure to write. And I got to do a Spider-Man one, a couple of X-Men ones. It just really, and Rob, who became the editor on it, let me put Death's Head in one. So the whole thing where Death's Head in Marvel UK had been replaced by Death's Head 2, I got to do a sort of what if version, which was almost Death's Head 1's revenge on that. So that was very satisfying too. But
Uh,
yeah, that
yeah.
that was great.
I think I drew a What If Spider-Man. Was it the
Y-
one?
Not my one, no.
No.
Don't think so. I don't think we worked together on any of the what ifs.
Right.
Um, you know, but one of our crossovers that we haven't mentioned was on Transformers Generation 2, which
Mm.
I guess we can talk some more about. It's a bit of another conversation for next time.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, definitely. A good place to end, ready
It
for a good
is.
place to pick up. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And, we'll also talk a little bit about the kind of what happened next once we were sort of cut off from that Marvel umbilical cord.
Mm.
It was a difficult time, I'm sure, for you, and certainly was for me. You know,
Mm.
my comics career felt like it had slightly stopped at that point. So
Mm.
we can talk a bit about that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That will be an interesting one to go through. Yeah. Lots of stuff people probably don't know that we got up to. Well, that sounds weird. No, but
Yes, indeed.
well,
But
we had to
great.
make a living, so yeah, we'll pick up on that next time. Brilliant.
Brilliant. Well, bye from me, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, goodbye from me. See you next time, everybody. See you next time, Simon, because I'm not going to speak to you between now and then.
No,
Got too
no,
much to do.
no, we've probably had another falling out.
Yeah, let's have another fallout. Yeah, okay. All right,
Right.
everybody. See ya.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you for listening to The Rest is Giant Robots. If you enjoyed what you heard, please consider subscribing for more and maybe share with like-minded friends. This has been a Wildfur production.